"You're hosting Thanksgiving this year," my mother announced over the phone, not asked, announced, in that tone she'd perfected over 3 decades, the one that made it clear this was already decided, and my input was neither requested nor desired. I stood in my apartment kitchen, still in my work clothes from TechVant Solutions, my senior engineering director badge still clipped to my blazer, and felt that familiar weight settle over my shoulders like a lead blanket I'd been carrying since childhood. "The whole family is coming, about 40 people, maybe 45, and we'll need you to cover everything, of course, since you have that nice salary now, and your apartment is big enough." The calculation came automatically, the way it always did when my family needed something. 45 people, full Thanksgiving spread. My mother's expectations of perfection, decorations, rentals, specialized accommodations for cousin Jennifer's gluten allergy, and Uncle Mike's diabetes, and Aunt Clara's insistence on organic everything. $4,000, maybe five. "Mom, that's a lot of people and a lot of expense," I started, already knowing how this would end, already feeling myself beginning to fold, because that's what I did, what I'd always done, what the responsible child does. "Maya, don't be difficult," she said, and I could practically hear her waving her hand dismissively the way she did, the gesture that had accompanied every accomplishment I'd tried to share with her, every award, every promotion, every moment I'd hoped she might actually see me. "Derek can't possibly host, he's between jobs again and going through a difficult time, and Vanessa is so busy with her social media career, she barely has time to breathe. You know how demanding that influencer life is." Between jobs. That was the phrase we used for my 35-year-old brother who'd been fired from his fifth position in 3 years, demanding influencer life. That was how we described my 28-year-old sister's part-time posting schedule that brought in maybe $15,000 a year. And me? I was simply expected to handle it, the way I'd handled Derek's rent 5 separate times, the way I'd handled Vanessa's car down payment, the way I'd handled every family emergency and expense and crisis that arose because I was the responsible one, the one with the stable job, the one who didn't cause problems. "I just got promoted, Mom," I said quietly, though I don't know why I bothered, why I still sought that recognition, that moment where she might say she was proud, might acknowledge that I'd worked 70-hour weeks for 6 months to lead the team that developed TechVance's new security protocol, that at 32 I was the youngest senior director in the company's history. "That's nice, honey," she said in that distracted tone that meant she wasn't really listening. "So you can definitely afford Thanksgiving. I'm thinking November 23rd. That gives you 2 weeks to prepare. I'll send you the full guest list and dietary requirements. Oh, and make sure you get good wine, none of that cheap stuff you served at Easter." I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her that I had plans with James, my boyfriend of 2 years, the architect who actually listened when I talked, who remembered details about my life, who'd been suggesting for months that my family took advantage of me. I wanted to say that $4,000 was $4,000 regardless of my salary, that I had student loans still and retirement savings and a life of my own. Instead, I heard myself say, "Okay, Mom," and hated the resignation in my voice, hated how easily I surrendered, hated that even now, even after everything, I was still that 7-year-old girl who'd won the science fair and watched her mother leave early to take Derek to baseball practice, still chasing approval from someone who would never give it. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the spreadsheet already filling with numbers that made my stomach turn. Line items in a budget I'd never wanted to create but couldn't seem to escape creating, because this was what I did. What I'd always done. Managed the family's expectations with my bank account. Premium heritage turkey from the specialty butcher my mother had texted me about at 11 p.m. the night before, organic and humanely raised, $380 for a bird that would serve 45 people who would probably complain it was dry. Organic ingredients for every side dish, because Aunt Clara had sent me a detailed message, about how conventional produce was poisoning the family, and she simply couldn't eat anything that wasn't certified organic. $1,200 at Whole Foods for vegetables and herbs and specialty items, the cashier's eyebrows raising as the total climbed higher and higher. Rental chairs and tables, because my apartment's dining setup could accommodate maybe 8 people comfortably, and I was somehow expected to seat $600 from the event supply company, the woman on the phone cheerfully asking if this was for a wedding. Decorations, because my mother had texted, "Make it elegant, Maya, not like that sad little setup you did for Easter." $400 in fall centerpieces and tablecloths and candles and seasonal flowers from the designer florist she'd recommended. Specialized dietary accommodations, because it wasn't enough to cook for 45 people. I also had to remember that cousin Jennifer had celiac disease, and Uncle Mike was diabetic, and Aunt Patricia was doing keto, and Vanessa was in her vegan phase this month. $800 in alternative ingredients and separate preparation supplies to avoid cross-contamination. A bartender service because Derek had texted, "There better be decent drinks, not just wine," and my mother had agreed that a full bar was expected for this kind of gathering, $450 for a professional to serve drinks for 5 hours. Upgraded dishes and servingware because my everyday plates weren't appropriate for a formal family dinner, according to my mother's follow-up text that included links to specific china patterns. $970 that I'd charged to my credit card at 2 in the morning after a 12-hour workday. Too tired to argue, too conditioned to comply. The total sat at the bottom of my spreadsheet like an accusation, $4,700. And that wasn't counting the wine my mother kept texting about, or the coffee she wanted, or the specific brand of cream Derek preferred, or any of the dozen other small requirements that kept arriving via text message throughout the 2 weeks I had to prepare. I worked late every night after leaving TechVance Solutions, leaving the office at 7 or 8 p.m. after managing my team of 15 engineers, after leading meetings about the security protocol that had gotten me promoted to senior engineering director, with a salary of $240,000 a year, a promotion my mother had acknowledged with, "That's nice, honey," before immediately asking if I'd ordered the turkey yet. Derek hadn't had a job in 4 months, his 5th termination in 3 years. This time from a sales position he'd insisted was beneath his talents. Even as I'd helped him get the interview through a professional contact who no longer returned my calls after Derek had apparently insulted the regional manager. Vanessa posted sponsored content maybe twice a week for her 30,000 Instagram followers, earning perhaps 15,000 a year while living in an apartment whose rent I suspected my mother was covering, though no one would admit that directly. Certainly no one would admit that my mother had asked me to cover Vanessa's security deposit 2 years ago, $3,500 I'd never seen returned. James found me at the kitchen table near midnight on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, surrounded by recipe printouts and shopping lists, and my mother's increasingly demanding text messages, and he sat down across from me with that expression he got when he was trying very hard to stay calm, the one where his jaw tightened just slightly and his architect's hands folded together with deliberate precision. "Maya," he said quietly, "you know they're taking advantage of you, right? You know this isn't normal, that families don't treat each other this way?" Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes from 3 hours of sleep, my alarm sounding at 4 a.m. while the city outside my windows was still dark and silent. And I moved through my apartment, turning on lights in rooms that had been transformed over the past 2 days into something my mother might approve of, though I doubted she would. Rental tables arranged in a configuration that had taken James and me 2 hours to figure out. Chairs positioned precisely, the fall centerpieces I'd spent $400 on arranged just so, elegant tablecloths in harvest gold that cost more than my monthly electricity bill, and everywhere I looked I saw money. My money, converted into a stage set for a performance I hadn't auditioned for, but was somehow expected to star in. The turkey went into the oven first, that $380 bird that I'd brined for 24 hours, according to the specific instructions my mother had texted me at midnight 2 days ago, and then I moved through the recipes I'd organized in a binder, each one annotated with dietary restrictions and preferences. The organic vegetables I'd paid $1,200 for waiting in careful arrangement in my refrigerator, and I worked in the methodical way I'd learned to work on complex engineering problems, breaking the enormous task into manageable pieces, trying not to think about the fact that I was doing all of this alone, that neither Derek nor Vanessa had offered to help, that my mother's only communication had been a text at 6 a.m. saying, "Don't forget the good wine." By 2 p.m., my apartment smelled like Thanksgiving should smell, like roasted turkey and fresh bread and cinnamon from the 3 pies I'd baked, and I'd changed into the dress my mother had told me to wear, something presentable for family photos. And I heard the first knock at the door with a sense of dread I tried to push down, tried to convert into something like anticipation, though I'd long ago stopped anticipating that these gatherings might be different. My mother arrived first with Aunt Clara and Uncle Mike, and her eyes swept over my apartment in that assessing way she had, and I waited for acknowledgement of the effort, the transformation, the elegant space I'd created, but what I got was, "Well, it smells fine, I suppose," in a tone that suggested fine was barely acceptable, and Aunt Clara immediately began complaining about the parking situation, as if I controlled the city's parking infrastructure. And Uncle Mike headed straight for the bar, where the professional bartender I'd paid $450 for was already setting up. Derek arrived 20 minutes later with his girlfriend of 3 months, a woman named Jessica, who looked vaguely uncomfortable, and his first words weren't hello or thank you, but, "Please tell me you got decent whiskey, not that bottom shelf stuff you usually buy." And I wanted to point him to the $200 bottle of premium Japanese whiskey I'd purchased specifically because he'd texted me about it. But I just nodded toward the bar and watched him walk away without acknowledging the food, the setup, the fact that I'd been awake for 10 hours already making this happen. Vanessa arrived in a cloud of perfume and attention, her phone already out and recording, and I watched her pan across the room, narrating to her followers about this amazing Thanksgiving dinner we planned, using "we" in a way that erased me entirely, that made it sound like she'd been part of the preparation, rather than texting me 2 days ago to make sure there would be vegan options, and I saw her followers' comments scrolling by. Hearts and fire emojis, and people saying how lucky she was to have such a great family. The next hour was a blur of arrivals, 43 people total by my count, cousins and second cousins and Aunt Patricia with her keto requirements, and cousin Jennifer with her celiac disease, and grandmother who squeezed my hand and whispered, "You've done too much, honey," in a way that made my eyes burn with tears I couldn't afford to shed. Not now, not yet. And I moved through the rooms refilling drinks and checking on food and answering questions about where the bathroom was and whether the stuffing was gluten-free, and every few minutes someone would make a comment, small digs that individually seemed minor, but collectively built into something heavier. Aunt Clara announced that the centerpieces were a bit much, don't you think? And Cousin Robert said the turkey looked dry before he'd even tasted it, and my mother kept rearranging things, moving the wine bottles and adjusting the napkins and repositioning the place cards I'd spent an evening creating, her actions broadcasting that nothing I did was quite right. And through it all, I smiled and nodded and played the role of gracious hostess, while something inside me grew quieter and smaller. When we finally sat down to eat, I'd barely made it to my seat before Derek raised his glass and said, "Here's to Maya, the family ATM, funding another holiday." And everyone laughed. They actually laughed, like it was a charming joke instead of a casual cruelty, and I looked down at my plate and felt James's hand find mine under the table, his grip tight with controlled anger. And I remembered suddenly, vividly, being 12 years old at Thanksgiving dinner and trying to tell everyone about winning the regional math competition, and how Derek had interrupted to talk about his C+ in algebra that he'd brought up to a B-, and how my mother had stood up and applauded him, actually applauded, while my championship certificate sat unmentioned in my backpack. I served everyone, making sure each person got their specific accommodations, the gluten-free options for Jennifer and the sugar-free desserts for Uncle Mike, and the entirely separate vegan meal I'd prepared for Vanessa, who filmed herself eating it while talking about how amazing it is when family really gets you. And I watched her rack up likes and comments while I stood in my kitchen eating standing up, too busy to sit, too anxious to rest. And James caught my eye from across the room where he'd been cornered by Aunt Patricia, and his expression was something between concern and fury. And I wondered if he was seeing clearly what I'd been unable or unwilling to see for 32 years, that this wasn't love, wasn't family, was something else entirely, something that took and called it tradition. Dinner ended around 6 p.m., the plates scattered with remnants of the meal I'd spent weeks planning and days preparing, and I moved through the rooms collecting empty wine glasses and used napkins while conversations continued around me as if I were staff rather than host. And my mother called out that dessert should be ready soon, not asking but telling, and I nodded and headed toward the kitchen where 3 pies waited on the counter: pumpkin and apple and pecan. Because Derek liked pecan, and Vanessa had requested apple, and my mother always expected pumpkin. And I was reaching for the pumpkin pie when I heard my mother's voice from the dining room, not raised but carrying in that way. Voices do when people think they're speaking privately, but aren't quite quiet enough. "Well, at least Maya is good for something," my mother said, and I froze with my hands on the pie dish. She can afford to do this kind of thing. I should have announced myself, should have walked in right then, but I stood there like I was 7 years old again and hiding at the top of the stairs, listening to my parents discuss whether I really needed those art classes I'd begged for, the answer being no because Derek needed new baseball equipment. "Yeah, it's not like she has a real life or anyone else to spend money on." Derek's voice, casual and dismissive, and I heard a few people laugh, and I wondered distantly if James could hear this from wherever he was in the apartment. "She's kind of boring, honestly," Vanessa said, my sister who I'd given $3,500 to for a car down payment, who I'd listened to cry about her breakups and her follower counts and her fear that she wasn't pretty enough. "This is like her purpose, you know, taking care of everyone. She's not really good at anything else." The pie dish was cold in my hands, and I realized I was gripping it hard enough that my knuckles had gone white. "I suppose we all have our place in the family," Aunt Clara added, her tone suggesting my place was something between servant and charity case. "Some of us are interesting, and some of us are useful." More laughter, and I felt something crack inside my chest, not dramatic or sudden, but quiet and final, like ice breaking on a lake in spring. "We should do this at Derek's place next year," my mother said. "Now that he's getting the business started, it would be good to show his success, have the family see he's doing well." There was a pause, and then Derek responded, "Sure, but Maya would still handle the cooking and pay for everything, right? I mean, that's her thing." "Of course," my mother agreed immediately. "And actually, speaking of Derek's business, Maya really should invest in it, help her brother out. I'm thinking 15,000 would be a good start. She can afford it with that job of hers." They were discussing my money like it was a communal resource, like my salary was the family fund, and they were talking about me like I was a convenience rather than a person, and the casual cruelty of their tone was somehow worse than if they'd been actively angry, because this was just how they saw me. Boring and useful, and not worth considering as someone with feelings or dreams, or any existence beyond my utility. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find James standing in the kitchen doorway, and the expression on his face told me he'd heard everything, had probably been standing there longer than I'd realized, and he looked at me with something like anguish mixed with fury, and he opened his mouth to speak, but I shook my head slightly because I needed a moment, just one more moment, to understand that the family I'd spent 32 years trying to please, trying to be good enough for, had never seen me as anything more than a wallet with a pulse, and that moment of understanding was my breaking point, the instant when something fundamental shifted, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was done. I set the pumpkin pie down on the dining room table with a control that surprised me, the dish making a soft sound against the wood, and 43 people in various states of conversation gradually fell silent as they registered something in my expression or my posture, or maybe just the fact that I was standing there looking at all of them with a clarity I'd never felt before. And I heard my own voice say, "I need everyone to leave now. Thanksgiving is over." And the words came out steady and calm and final. The silence that followed was complete, the kind of silence that feels like pressure in your ears. And then my mother laughed, a nervous sound that was trying to convert my statement into a joke, and she said, "Maya, don't be dramatic. We haven't even had dessert yet." And I looked at her directly and said, "I'm not being dramatic. I'm telling you that Thanksgiving is over and I need everyone to leave my apartment now." Derek set down his wine glass with enough force that it sloshed onto the tablecloth I'd rented for $60 and said, "What's your problem?" And I felt James move to stand beside me, not touching me but present, a solid reminder that I wasn't alone, and I said, "I heard what you said. All of you. Every word." I watched the realization move across their faces, watched my mother's expression shift from confusion to calculation, watched Derek and Vanessa exchange a look that was pure panic, and Aunt Clara had the grace to at least look uncomfortable, and my mother recovered first because she always did, saying, "Sweetheart, I don't know what you think you heard, but you're misunderstanding." And I shook my head and said, "I heard you say that I'm at least good for something because I can afford to do this kind of thing. I heard Derek say I don't have a real life. I heard Vanessa call me boring and say this is my purpose. I heard you discuss having me fund Derek's business and pay for next year's Thanksgiving that I wouldn't even be hosting. I heard all of it." Vanessa stood up quickly and said, "We were just joking. Oh my God, Maya, you're being so sensitive. We joke around all the time." And I looked at my younger sister, who I'd given $3,500 to, who I'd comforted through breakups and career anxiety and body image issues, and I said, "That wasn't joking. That was you discussing my value to this family, and apparently my value is financial and nothing else." My mother's tone shifted to authority, the voice she'd used when I was young and had displeased her, and she said, "Young lady, you don't speak to me this way, and you certainly don't speak to your family this way. Now apologize, and let's move past this little scene you're making." I felt something like electricity move through my body, adrenaline or rage or possibly just the accumulated weight of 32 years of being dismissed, and I said, "I'm 32 years old and I just spent $4,800 on people who think I'm boring and only good for money. Get out of my home." Uncle Mike, who barely ever spoke, said, "Maya, you're overreacting over nothing. It was a private conversation. You weren't meant to hear it." And I wanted to laugh at the logic, that the cruelty was acceptable as long as I didn't know about it. And Derek stood up and said, "Are you seriously going to ruin Thanksgiving over this? Over a private conversation?" And I looked at him, really looked at him, this man who was 3 years older than me and had never once in my memory supported me, or thanked me, or treated me as anything other than a resource to extract from, and I said, "I'm not ruining Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was ruined the moment you decided to sit in my home, eating food I paid for and prepared, and discuss how boring I am, and how my only purpose is to fund your lives." The protest started then, multiple voices overlapping, and my mother reached for tears, her eyes going shiny in that way she could manufacture, and she said, "Maya, sweetheart, you're breaking my heart, after everything I've done for you, after I raised you." And I felt James's hand briefly touch my back, a reminder to stay strong, and I pointed to the door and said, "Leave, or I'll call the police for trespassing." Aunt Clara stood up from her chair with enough force that it scraped against the hardwood floor I'd spent 3 hours cleaning the night before, and she said, "Ungrateful, that's what you are, absolutely ungrateful. We come here as family and you throw us out like we're nothing." And I looked at her, this woman who had never once asked how I was doing, who had never acknowledged a single one of my accomplishments, and I said, "You came here as guests to a dinner I paid $4,800 for. And you sat in my home discussing how boring I am and how my only value is financial. So yes, I'm asking you to leave." And Uncle Mike shook his head and said, "Maya, you're overreacting over nothing. People talk. It's what they do. You're acting like we committed some crime." And the casual dismissal of my hurt was so familiar it almost made me laugh. And Derek stepped toward me with his jaw tight and said, "You're really going to ruin Thanksgiving over a private conversation? You're going to destroy this family because you're too sensitive to handle reality?" And something inside me that had been holding back finally broke open completely. And I heard myself say, "Let me tell you about reality, Derek. Reality is that I've paid your rent 5 times in the past 4 years, totaling $8,900. Reality is that I gave Vanessa $3,500 for a car down payment. Reality is that I gave Mom $6,000 for her kitchen renovation that she promised to pay back and never did. Reality is that I've paid for countless dinners and gifts and emergencies, and not once, not one single time, has any of you thanked me or treated me like I was anything other than a bank account with legs." I watched the faces around the room shift as I spoke, watched cousins and aunts and uncles exchange uncomfortable glances, and my mother's face had gone pale except for 2 spots of red high on her cheeks, and she said, "Maya, that's family. That's what family does. We help each other." And I said, "Help goes both ways, Mom. When have any of you helped me? When have you been there for anything I needed?" The silence that followed was answer enough, and my mother's eyes filled with tears. Real or manufactured, I couldn't tell anymore, and she pressed her hand to her chest and said, "You're breaking my heart. After everything I've sacrificed for you. After I raised you and loved you." And I felt my resolve waver for just a second, because that was her power, making me feel guilty for having boundaries. But then I remembered them laughing about me being boring, discussing my money like it belonged to them, and I pointed to the door again and said, "Leave, or I'll call the police for trespassing." And James moved past me and started gathering coats from the closet in the hallway, and some of the family members began standing, Cousin Jennifer whispering, "This is insane," to her husband. Aunt Patricia muttering, "Well, I never," as she collected her purse, and Derek suddenly grabbed the platter with the leftover turkey, the premium organic turkey I'd paid $380 for, and headed toward the door, and I stepped in front of him and said, "Put it down." And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind and said, "What? It's just leftovers." And I said, "You don't get to take anything from my home. Put it down now." And he stared at me for a long moment, something like shock registering in his eyes, because I had never, not once in 32 years, denied him anything he wanted. And he set the platter down on the entry table with a thud and said, "You've lost it. You've actually lost your mind." And I said, "No, I finally found it." The family began moving toward the door in a slow, chaotic wave. Some people gathering their coats and bags with tight-lipped silence, others making comments they thought I couldn't hear. Cousin Jennifer saying to her husband, "She's having some kind of breakdown." Aunt Patricia muttering, "Always knew there was something off about that girl." And the younger cousins looked confused, 12-year-old Emma asking her mother, "Why is everyone leaving?" and being shushed without explanation, and I stood by the dining room archway watching them file past me like I was a stranger instead of the person who had just fed them a $4,800 meal. And then my grandmother appeared in front of me, this small woman of 78 with silver hair and sharp eyes that had always seen more than she said, and she reached up and squeezed my hand and whispered, "About time, honey." And the validation in those 3 words nearly broke me, nearly made me cry right there. But she was already moving past me toward the door, because despite understanding she was still leaving with them, still part of the exodus, and I felt Vanessa before I saw her, heard the distinctive sound of her phone camera as she filmed herself crying dramatically, her voice pitched high and wounded as she said to her followers, "I can't believe this is happening. Family is supposed to be forever, but some people just turn on you." And she was actually crying real tears, though whether from genuine hurt or performed victimhood I couldn't tell anymore. And she walked past me without making eye contact, still filming. And I knew by tomorrow there would be vague posts about betrayal and fake people, and her comment section would be full of supporters who had no idea what had actually happened. And my mother stood in the center of the living room like she was on a stage, her purse clutched to her chest. And she said, "Maya, if we leave now, don't expect us at Christmas. Don't expect us to call you. Don't expect us to forgive this." And I looked at her, this woman who had given birth to me and raised me and somehow never actually seen me, and I said, "I don't." And I watched her face change, watched the calculation in her eyes that had expected me to cave at the threat of exclusion, watched her realize that the leverage she'd held over me for 32 years had suddenly lost all its power, and Derek appeared beside her and said, "You'll regret this, Maya. You're going to regret this so much." And something in his tone made James move forward until he was standing slightly in front of me, and James said in a voice I'd never heard him use before, cold and hard, "That sounded like a threat. Do you want to repeat it?" And Derek's eyes widened, and he took a step back and muttered, "Whatever, she's not worth it," and headed for the door. And the last person to leave was Aunt Clara, who paused in the doorway and turned back to me and said, "Your father would be ashamed of you." And the words hit exactly where she'd aimed them, because my father had died 6 years ago of a heart attack at 59, worked himself to death at a job he hated to provide for a family that never appreciated him. And I felt the wound of her words. But then I felt something else, a clarity. And I said, "My father died working himself to death trying to please people who never appreciated him. I learned from his mistake." And Aunt Clara's mouth opened and closed, and then she turned and left, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded final, and the apartment was suddenly silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. And I stood there, looking at 43 place settings of dirty dishes and crumpled napkins and half-empty wine glasses scattered across every surface, the wreckage of the last Thanksgiving I would ever host for people who had never valued me at all. James and I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by the wreckage of what had been an elegant Thanksgiving dinner just 3 hours before, and the silence felt like it had weight, like something physical pressing against my ears after all the voices and accusations and the sound of the door closing behind 43 people who I'd fed and hosted and who had left my home like I was the villain in a story I hadn't known I was living. I didn't cry. Not yet. I think I was still in shock at what I'd done, at the fact that I had actually thrown my entire family out of my apartment. And James turned to me and pulled me into his arms and said, "I'm so proud of you." And those 4 words broke something loose in my chest, but still the tears didn't come. And he kissed the top of my head and said, "Let's order Chinese food." And the mundane practicality of it made me laugh, actually laugh, because we were standing in a disaster zone of dirty dishes and crumpled napkins, and someone had spilled red wine on my cream-colored rug, and we were going to order takeout like it was a normal Thursday night. We sat on the couch eating lo mein and spring rolls straight from the containers, while my phone on the coffee table started buzzing with such frequency that it danced across the surface. And I picked it up and watched the notifications scroll past, text after text from different family members, and I opened them one by one while James watched my face. Aunt Patricia had written, "You owe your mother an apology. What you did was disgraceful." And Cousin Jennifer sent, "I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't who you are." And Derek had sent 3 messages. The first saying, "You're going to regret this." The second saying, "You owe me $2,200 for the money I lent you in college." Which was fascinating because he had never lent me money, ever, not once in our entire lives. And the third message said, "Mom is devastated. Hope you're happy." And I scrolled further and found a message from my mother that was 8 paragraphs long about family loyalty and how she'd sacrificed everything for her children, and how I had changed, how I wasn't the daughter she raised, how blood was supposed to mean something, and the message ended with, "I hope whatever point you were trying to make was worth losing your family over." I saw that Vanessa had posted on Instagram, not a direct message but a public post that I could see because I hadn't blocked her yet. A photo of herself looking sad with a caption that read, When you realize some people in your life are fake and family doesn't mean what you thought it meant. Betrayal hurts worst when it comes from the people you love. Family drama, hashed toxic people, hashed know your worth. And the comments below were full of heart emojis and people saying, "You deserve better, babe," and "cut them off, sis." And she had positioned herself as the victim so quickly and efficiently that I had to admire the skill, even as it made me feel sick. I turned my phone off completely, just held down the button until the screen went black, and James said, "Good." And we finished our Chinese food, and then we started cleaning. And it took us 3 hours to wash all 43 place settings and put away the rental tables and chairs and scrub the wine stain and bag up the garbage. And at one point, I opened the cabinet where I'd stored the expensive liquor and found the $200 bottle of whiskey that Derek had complained didn't exist, and it was half empty, and I held it up to show James, and he shook his head and said, "Of course he did." And that small detail somehow hurt more than the big ones. The casual entitlement of drinking expensive whiskey and then pretending it had never been there, and then trying to steal leftovers on his way out. While we cleaned, James said, "You should document everything, just in case this gets worse." And I nodded. And after we finished, I sat down at my laptop and opened a spreadsheet and titled it Family Financial History. And I started entering every instance I could remember of money I'd given to family members over the past 8 years. Derek's rent payments and Vanessa's car down payment and Mom's kitchen renovation and the emergency dental work I'd paid for Aunt Clara and the graduation money I'd given to 3 different cousins and the countless dinners and birthday gifts and holiday presents, and I was meticulous, going through old bank statements and Venmo history and credit card receipts. And when I added up the final column, the number read $47,300. And I sat there staring at that number in complete disbelief, because I had known I'd given them money, but I hadn't known it was that much, hadn't realized that over 8 years I had given my family the equivalent of a luxury car or a down payment on a house. And James looked over my shoulder and said, "Jesus, Maya." And I saved the spreadsheet and closed my laptop, and finally, I cried. I woke up the Friday after Thanksgiving feeling like I'd survived something catastrophic, like a car accident or a natural disaster, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind strangely clear. And when I reached for my phone on the nightstand, I hesitated before turning it on because I knew what would be waiting for me, and when the screen lit up, the notifications started cascading. 127 messages, and I scrolled through them with James still asleep beside me, and most were exactly what I'd expected. Aunt Patricia demanding I explain myself, Cousin Jennifer saying I owed everyone an apology, Uncle Mike writing, "Your mother is devastated, you need to make this right." And Derek had sent 4 more messages overnight, each one angrier than the last, the final one reading, "You owe me for everything I've done for you over the years. You ungrateful bitch." And I stared at that message, trying to remember a single thing Derek had ever done for me, and came up empty. Not one memory of support or kindness or even basic brotherly affection. But then I scrolled further and found 3 messages from my grandmother. The first sent at 11 p.m. saying, "I'm proud of you." The second at 11:30 saying, "Call me when you're ready to talk." And the third at midnight saying, "You deserve better than how they've treated you. I should have said something years ago." And those 3 messages made my eyes blur with tears. And then I saw 2 messages from Cousin Sophie, who I hadn't been particularly close to, but who had always been kind in a quiet way. And her first message said, "Maya, I heard what happened. I just want you to know I've always thought they treated you unfairly." And her second message said, "You're not crazy. You're not wrong. I've seen it for years, and I'm glad you finally stood up for yourself." And I sat there in bed reading those 5 messages over and over, 3 from grandmother and 2 from Sophie. And the tears that hadn't come last night finally started falling. Not from sadness exactly, but from something like release, like I'd been holding my breath for 32 years and finally someone had given me permission to exhale. I called my grandmother at 9 in the morning, my hands shaking as I dialed, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting, and she said, "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you called." And I started crying for real then, sitting on my couch in my pajamas with morning light coming through the windows. And she let me cry for a minute before she said, "I tried to say something over the years. I tried to tell your mother she was too hard on you, that she needed to see what you were accomplishing, but she would shut me down, tell me I didn't understand, tell me she was preparing you for the real world." And I said, "Why is she like this? Why does she hate me?" And my grandmother was quiet for a moment and then said, "She doesn't hate you, Maya. She's jealous of you. She always has been. You became everything she wished she could be, and instead of being proud, she resented it. She sees your success as a reflection of her own failures, and that's not fair to you. That's never been fair to you." And that realization hit me like a physical thing, reframed every childhood memory, every dismissed achievement, every time my mother had minimized my accomplishments or rolled her eyes at my excitement. And my grandmother said, "I'd like to take you to dinner next week, just the two of us, if you'd be willing." And I said yes immediately. And after we hung up, James emerged from the bedroom and found me crying on the couch and held me while I told him everything my grandmother had said, and he suggested we get away for the weekend, just drive up to the mountains and decompress. And by 2 that afternoon, we were in his car heading toward a cabin he'd found online, leaving the city and my phone and all those angry messages behind. And I watched the landscape change outside the window and felt something in my chest start to loosen, start to believe that maybe I really could be free. The cabin was small and rustic, with knotty pine walls and a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over mountains still dusted with early snow. And for 2 days, James and I barely left except to walk the property, and we spent most of our time on the worn leather couch in front of the fire, while I talked through memories I'd been suppressing for years. Memories that kept surfacing now that I'd finally cracked open the door I'd kept sealed for so long. I told James about being 7 years old and winning the regional science fair with my project on water purification, how I'd been so excited and proud, and my mother had said she would come to the award ceremony, but then Derek had a little league game at the same time, just a regular season game, nothing important, and she'd gone to that instead and sent my father to the science fair. And my father had been proud but distracted, checking his watch because he had to get back to work. And that weekend, my mother had thrown Derek a huge party because his team had won, invited all the neighbors, ordered a custom cake, and I'd kept waiting for someone to mention my blue ribbon, and no one ever did. It sat on my desk in my room where no one saw it but me. I told him about high school graduation, where I'd been valedictorian, which meant I gave a speech in front of 800 people, and I'd worked on that speech for weeks. And I'd looked out into the audience during my delivery and seen my family's seats and watched them stand up halfway through and leave. And afterward, when I asked my mother why she said the ceremony was too long and she'd had a headache and they'd heard the important part, and I'd asked which part was the important part, and she'd looked at me like I was being difficult and said, "The beginning, Maya, don't be dramatic." And I'd felt so small, so unimportant, like I'd accomplished something that should have mattered and it had evaporated the moment I wanted someone to care. James listened without interrupting, his arm around my shoulders, and I kept talking, told him about college graduation where my mother had complained the entire day about parking and how expensive the area was and how pretentious everyone seemed. And my father had been quiet like always, taking pictures when my mother told him to, and Derek hadn't come at all because he'd said he had to work. But I'd later seen his Facebook photos from that weekend at someone's beach house. And Vanessa had been there but spent the whole ceremony texting and then left right after without wanting to get dinner because she had plans with friends. I told James about my first major promotion to senior engineer 3 years ago, when I'd been so proud. When I'd made reservations at a nice restaurant to celebrate with my family. And 15 minutes into dinner, Derek had announced his engagement to his girlfriend of 6 months, and everything had shifted to that. Everyone asking questions and making toasts, and my mother crying happy tears. And I'd sat there with my promotion announcement still half said, and watched my moment disappear into Derek's news. And no one had noticed. Or if they'd noticed, they hadn't cared, and I'd paid for that dinner too. $280 for a celebration of my brother's engagement at what was supposed to be my promotion dinner. James was quiet after I finished, and then he said, I almost said something so many times, at least a dozen times over the past 2 years I've known you. I watched them do this to you over and over, and I wanted to tell you what I was seeing, but I knew you had to reach that breaking point yourself. If I'd pushed you before you were ready, you might have just defended them. And I realized he was right. That 6 months ago, if he'd told me my family was toxic, I would have made excuses, would have said they didn't mean it that way, would have convinced myself I was too sensitive. We talked about the future, about what came next, and James said, you need to set permanent boundaries, maybe go low contact or no contact until things change, if they ever change. And the suggestion felt radical and terrifying, and also like relief, and I said, I never thought I could do that. I never realized I could choose how much contact to have with them. And James looked at me with such sadness and said, Maya, you're an adult. You can choose everything about your life, including who's in it. And that concept felt revolutionary, felt like someone had just told me I could fly, that the cage I'd been living in had never actually been locked. We made a plan sitting there on that couch with the fire crackling and the mountains dark outside the windows, and I decided no contact with anyone except grandmother and Sophie until or unless I received a genuine apology, and even if I received an apology, I would proceed carefully, would not let them back into full access to my life, and no more money to anyone for any reason, no loans, no gifts beyond normal birthday or Christmas presents, no emergency bailouts, no funding anyone's dreams or covering anyone's rent. I was done being the family ATM. I felt lighter just saying it out loud, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't know I could put down. And James kissed my forehead and said, I'm proud of you. I know this isn't easy. And I said, it's the easiest hard thing I've ever done. And we spent the rest of the weekend in that peaceful cabin. And I felt something in my chest start to unknot. Start to believe that maybe the life I'd been living wasn't the only option, that there was another way to exist in the world where I wasn't constantly braced for dismissal, constantly trying to earn love that was never going to be freely given. We got back to my apartment Sunday evening around 7, and the city felt loud and harsh after the quiet of the mountains. And when I unlocked my door and turned on the lights, everything looked the same as when we'd left, except now it felt different, like I was different. And I made tea while James brought in our bags, and then I opened my laptop to check my work email and saw it sitting there in my personal inbox, an email from Derek with the subject line, What you did, and my stomach clenched, but I clicked it anyway because I knew ignoring it wouldn't make it disappear. The email was long, 12 paragraphs of single-spaced text, and it started with Maya, I can't believe you would do this to our family, and went on to detail how I had ruined his chance to announce his girlfriend Brittany's pregnancy at Thanksgiving dinner, how they'd been planning to share the news over dessert, how it would have been this beautiful family moment, and I had destroyed it with your dramatic tantrum. And I sat there staring at the screen thinking about how I'd overheard them talking about me in my own dining room, how Derek had said I had no real life, how none of them had mentioned any pregnancy, how this was obviously something he'd constructed afterward to make me the villain. The email continued with him blaming me for tearing the family apart, saying that Mom was devastated and crying every day, that Vanessa was traumatized by your behavior, that I had embarrassed everyone in front of the entire extended family. And then it shifted into the truly manipulative part where he wrote, After everything I've done for you over the years, all the times I was there for you when you needed support, this is how you repay me? And I actually laughed out loud at that line, because I could not think of a single instance where Derek had supported me. Not one memory of him being there when I needed help. And I scrolled back through 32 years of memories, searching for even one example, and came up empty. The email's final paragraphs demanded that I pay him $2,000 for emotional distress and therapy costs, because your actions have seriously affected my mental health and my relationship. And he added, Plus, you owe me anyway for all those times I covered for you with Mom and Dad, for all the times I helped you out. You have a short memory, Maya, but I don't. And the audacity of it took my breath away. This complete rewriting of history, this claiming of support that had never existed. And then the final line: I expect payment by Friday, or I'll have no choice but to pursue this legally. You've always had money to throw around, so $2,000 should be nothing to you, unless you want to be selfish about this too. I read it 3 times, each time feeling my anger crystallize into something clearer and harder. And then I took screenshots of the entire email and saved them to the documentation folder James had suggested I create, the folder that now contained the spreadsheet showing $47,300 in family loans and gifts, photos of the receipts from Thanksgiving, and a timeline of events I'd written at the cabin. I opened a reply and typed one single line: No, don't contact me again. I hit send before I could second guess myself, and then immediately went into my email settings and blocked Derek's address. And the moment I clicked that final button, I felt something like power, like I was finally taking up space in my own life. 10 minutes later, my phone rang from an unknown number, and I answered it without thinking, expecting a spam call, and instead heard my mother's voice. Except it wasn't the voice she usually used with me. Wasn't the cold, dismissive tone or even the fake, sweet manipulation voice. This was pure rage, and she started screaming before I could even say hello. How dare you treat your brother that way? How dare you ignore his very reasonable request after what you did? You ruined his announcement. You humiliated this entire family. Everyone is talking about you. Everyone thinks you're unstable. And maybe they're right. Maybe there is something seriously wrong with you. I'm going to tell everyone what you're really like. I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth about how selfish and crazy you are. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone away from my ear while her voice poured out in a stream of accusations and threats. And I felt my hands start to shake, but my voice came out steady when I brought the phone back and said, I'm going to hang up now, and if you contact me again or harass me further, I will pursue a restraining order. Do you understand me? And I didn't wait for her response before I ended the call, and then stood there in my kitchen with my heart pounding and my hands trembling, and the knowledge that I had just threatened my own mother with legal action. And James came out of the bedroom where he'd been unpacking and took one look at my face and said, What happened? And I told him about both the email and the phone call, and he held my shaking hands and said, You did exactly the right thing. You set a boundary and you enforced it. I'm proud of you. And I realized that even though my hands were shaking and my heart was racing, I felt strong, stronger than I'd ever felt in my interactions with my family, because for the first time in my life I had said no and meant it, and I hadn't apologized, and I hadn't backed down, and the world hadn't ended. I was still standing in my apartment with someone who loved me, telling me I'd done the right thing, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. 2 weeks passed, and I maintained my boundaries despite what felt like a coordinated siege. Relatives I barely knew reaching out on behalf of my mother, my Aunt Clara's husband sending a Facebook message asking if we could talk this through like adults. Even my mother's best friend Karen calling to say she was worried about me and thought I should consider forgiveness. And I politely declined every overture and blocked the numbers that wouldn't take no for an answer. And through it all, I felt stronger, like each boundary I held made the next one easier. Early December, on a gray Saturday afternoon, I met Sophie at a coffee shop in Fremont, a place with exposed brick and mismatched furniture where we could talk without running into family. And she slid into the chair across from me, looking nervous and excited at the same time. And before I could even ask how she was doing, she leaned forward and said, Maya, you need to know what's happening. The family is in complete chaos. And then she told me everything. Derek's girlfriend Brittany had left him, had broken up with him 3 days after Thanksgiving. And according to Sophie, it was because Brittany had finally met the family at Thanksgiving and seen how they treated people, seen how they talked about me after I kicked them out. And she'd apparently told Derek that if that was how his family operated, she wanted nothing to do with them or him. and Derek was devastated and blaming me for it, telling everyone I'd poisoned Brittany against him, even though Brittany had never even spoken to me. Sophie said my mother was playing the victim to anyone who would listen, calling extended family members and friends and people from church, telling them all that I'd had some kind of breakdown, that she was worried about my mental health, that she'd tried everything to reach me, but I was refusing help. And the story she was telling had nothing to do with what had actually happened. It was a complete revision where she was the concerned, loving mother and I was the unstable daughter who'd inexplicably cut everyone off. Vanessa's social media followers had started questioning her vague posts about family drama and betrayal. Sophie showed me some of the comments on her phone, people asking for context, some people calling Vanessa out for playing victim without explaining what actually happened. And apparently, Vanessa had deleted several posts and was now claiming she wanted to keep family matters private, even though she'd been the one broadcasting everything in the first place. Sophie told me that Aunt Clara had admitted to Cousin Rachel that she might have been a little harsh with me, but it wasn't an apology, just an acknowledgement, and no one else had expressed any regret at all. They were all just circling wagons around my mother and Derek and acting like I was the villain in a story they'd made up. Sophie looked at me across the table and asked, "Are you going to relent for Christmas? Everyone thinks you'll come around by then." And I said, "No, I'm not going to Christmas. I'm not going to anything until someone actually apologizes and means it, and maybe not even then." And I watched her process that, watched her realize I was serious, and then she said something that surprised me. "I've been thinking about setting some boundaries too. They treat me okay because I'm young and they think I still need them, but I see how conditional it all is, how you're only valued if you're useful, or if you do what they want, and I don't want to live like that." I realized in that moment that my stand was affecting more than just me, that maybe Sophie had been watching for years the same way I had been enduring, and maybe my refusal to accept the unacceptable had given her permission to imagine something different for herself. We talked for 2 hours, and when we left, I felt less alone than I had in weeks, and I drove home thinking about how my life had shifted in those 2 weeks. How work was thriving because I wasn't emotionally depleted all the time. My team had nominated me for the company's leadership award, which came with recognition and a significant bonus. And I'd been investing time in friendships I'd neglected. Having dinner with my college roommate Lisa, going to a concert with my coworker Jen, actually showing up as a full person instead of the exhausted ghost I'd been when all my energy went to managing my family's emotions and expectations. James's parents had called and invited me to their Christmas celebration, his mother Sharon saying, "We'd love to have you, Maya. You're part of James's life, which makes you part of ours." And the casual warmth of it had made me cry because it was so simple, so unconditional, nothing I had to earn or pay for or justify. My grandmother called every Sunday like clockwork, conversations where we talked about everything and nothing, where she told me stories about my grandfather and her own struggles with my mother over the years, and I was building something real with her, something that had always been there but had been buried under the dysfunction. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending on my toxic family obligations, how much of myself I'd been sacrificing to maintain relationships with people who didn't actually care about me. And now that I'd stopped, now that I'd redirected all that energy into my own life and the people who genuinely valued me, I felt lighter, freer, like I'd been carrying a backpack full of rocks for 32 years and had finally been given permission to set it down. Mid-December, I came home from work on a Wednesday evening to find a handwritten envelope in my mailbox with my mother's distinctive slanted cursive on the front, "No return address," and my stomach dropped because she'd never handwritten me anything. Our communication had always been texts and phone calls and occasional emails, never letters, and I carried it upstairs feeling like I was holding something that might explode. I made myself a cup of tea first, put on comfortable clothes, sat on my couch with James beside me for support, and then I opened it carefully, unfolding 3 pages of cream-colored stationery covered in that same slanted writing. and I started reading with my heart already hardening, because some part of me knew this wasn't going to be the apology I'd been refusing to hope for. The letter started, "My dearest Maya," which should have been my first warning because she'd never called me that, and then it launched into a description of a health scare she'd supposedly had, chest pains and dizziness, a visit to the emergency room, tests that were concerning, doctors who were worried. And she wrote, "They asked me about stress in my life, and I had to tell them about our estrangement, about how my daughter won't speak to me, and the doctor said that this kind of family stress can have serious physical effects, especially at my age. And Maya, I'm frightened. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I know that the stress of you cutting me off is making everything worse." I read those lines twice, feeling the manipulation of it settle over me like oil, the way she'd constructed a medical crisis, and then made it my fault, made my boundaries into something that was physically harming her. And the letter continued with her saying she wanted to reconcile before something happens, before it was too late. But then came the conditions, the twist that revealed the truth of it. "I think we can move past this if you're willing to apologize for what happened at Thanksgiving. If you can acknowledge that your reaction was extreme and hurtful. We all make mistakes. Maya and I raised you to be bigger than this, to be the one who extends grace and brings the family together. I raised you better than this." I stared at that line. "I raised you better than this," and felt something cold and clear settle in my chest, because there it was, the summary of everything, the belief that she had raised me to accept mistreatment and call it grace, to sacrifice myself and call it family, to absorb their cruelty and call it love. The letter ended with her saying she was praying for me, hoping I would come to my senses, and that she would always love me, despite everything. And she signed it Mom, with a little heart, and I set it down on my coffee table and looked at James and said, "She's faking a health crisis to manipulate me into apologizing." And even saying it out loud felt surreal, felt like naming something I'd always known but never wanted to admit, that my mother would use any tool available, including phantom illness, to control me. I didn't respond to the letter, didn't call, didn't text, just put it in my documentation folder with everything else, and 2 days later on Friday afternoon, Sophie texted me, "Hey, just so you know, your mom is completely fine, no health issues. She told Rachel yesterday that she had to try something to bring Maya back in line." Those were her actual words. "I thought you should know." I read that text sitting at my desk at work and felt the last remaining thread of doubt or guilt snap cleanly, because she hadn't just manipulated me, she'd been calculating about it, had strategized about what tactic might work, had deliberately constructed a lie designed to exploit my compassion. And the fact that she'd been stupid enough to admit it to Rachel, who told Sophie, who told me, just proved how assured she was of her power over me, how certain she was that even if I found out, I'd still come back. That evening, James suggested something his therapist had once recommended to him, writing an unsent letter, getting everything out on paper without the pressure of sending it. And I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote 5 pages to my mother, wrote about being 7 years old at the science fair, about high school graduation, about every Thanksgiving and Christmas and birthday where I'd felt invisible, about the $47,300, about overhearing them call me boring and purposeless, about this final fake health crisis, and I wrote the truth I'd never been allowed to speak. "You never loved me for who I am. You only loved what I could do for you, and I don't think you even realize the difference. I don't think you're capable of understanding that children are people with feelings and needs, and not just extensions of yourself, and I'm done trying to make you see me because you don't want to. Seeing me as a real person would mean acknowledging how badly you've treated me, and you'll never do that. So this is me letting go. This is me accepting that I will never have the mother I needed, and that's not my failure. It's yours." I read it over once, crying through the last 2 pages, and then James and I built a fire in my fireplace, something I'd never actually used before, and I burned all 5 pages one at a time and watched my words turn to ash and smoke, and it felt like release. like finally exhaling after holding my breath for 32 years. The next morning, I went online and made a donation of exactly $4,800 to a women's shelter in Seattle, a place that helped women escape toxic family situations and rebuild their lives. And in the donation form, where it asked if I wanted this gift to be in honor of someone, I typed my own name, Maya Chen, because I was reclaiming that money, transforming it from a symbol of my family's exploitation into something that would actually help people. And when the confirmation email arrived with the receipt, I printed it and put it on my refrigerator where I could see it every day. A reminder that I got to choose what my resources supported, that my money and my time and my energy were mine to direct toward things that mattered, toward people who genuinely needed help, rather than people who felt entitled to my endless sacrifice. Christmas week arrived, and James invited me to his family's celebration on December 23rd, a casual evening gathering at his parents' house in Ballard, and I felt nervous driving there even though I'd met his parents, Sharon and David, several times before. But this felt different. This was a family holiday event, and I was attending as someone who'd just cut off her entire family, and I worried they'd think I was broken, or difficult, or toxic myself. But the moment Sharon opened the door, she pulled me into a warm hug and said, "Maya, we're so glad you're here. Come in, come in. It's freezing out there." And the house smelled like cinnamon and pine and something baking. And there were maybe 15 people there. James's parents and his sister Rachel with her husband and 2 kids, his aunt and uncle, a few family friends. And over the next 3 hours, I experienced something I'd never quite felt before. People asking me genuine questions about my work and actually listening to the answers. James's uncle Tom asking about software engineering and seeming genuinely interested when I explained what I did. His niece showing me her art project and wanting to know what I thought. Sharon thanking me twice for coming and saying, "It means so much to have you here." And no one asked me to do anything or pay for anything or justify my presence. I was just welcomed as a person, as someone who mattered because I was important to James, and that was enough. Rachel gave me a glass of wine and sat with me on the couch and talked about her work as a teacher. And when I mentioned I donated to a women's shelter, she said, "That's beautiful, Maya. The world needs more people who put their resources toward helping others." And I almost cried because she'd called it beautiful, not expected, not obligatory, not my purpose, just a choice I'd made that she appreciated. And the contrast to my own family was so stark, it was almost physically painful. The difference between being valued and being used, between being welcomed and being tolerated as long as I was useful. When it was time for gift exchange, Sharon handed me a wrapped package and I said, "Oh, you didn't have to get me anything." And she smiled and said, "I wanted to." And I opened it to find a hardcover book by Celeste Ng. And I stared at it confused for a moment before I remembered that 2 months ago, at a dinner, I'd mentioned loving Little Fires Everywhere and wanting to read her other work. And Sharon had remembered that one comment, had filed it away, and thought of me when she saw this book. And I looked up at her with tears in my eyes and said, "You remembered." And she looked surprised that I was surprised and said, "Of course I remembered. You told me you loved her writing." And I had to excuse myself to the bathroom where I stood looking at myself in the mirror thinking, this is what family should feel like. This is what it means to be seen and heard and remembered. Not for what you can provide, but for who you are. And I'd lived 32 years without knowing that difference. 32 years thinking that love meant sacrifice and service and endless giving while receiving nothing but criticism and demands in return. Christmas Day itself I spent with my grandmother, driving to her small house in West Seattle where she'd prepared a simple dinner for just the two of us. Turkey breast and mashed potatoes and green beans. Nothing elaborate, just good food and quiet company. And after we ate, she handed me an envelope and said, "Open this now, Maya. I need to explain it to you." And I opened it to find a check for $6,000 and a note card in her shaky handwriting that read, "This is the money your mother borrowed from me 3 years ago to renovate her kitchen, which I've just learned she told you that you paid for. She lied to us both. Use this for something that brings you joy." And I read it 3 times before I could look up at my grandmother, and she was watching me with tears in her eyes. And she said, "Your mother called me last week asking for money for Christmas presents, and when I told her I'd given what I could to help with her kitchen renovation, she didn't know what I was talking about. And it all came out. She'd taken money from both of us for the same renovation and lied about where it came from. And Maya, I'm so sorry. I should have compared notes with you years ago. I should have protected you from her better." I sat there holding this check that represented another layer of my mother's manipulation, another lie, another way she'd exploited people who loved her, and my grandmother reached across the table and took my hand and said, "I failed you. I saw how she treated you differently than Derek and Vanessa, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that parents have their own relationships with their children. But I was wrong. I should have stood up for you. I should have called her out every single time she diminished you, or used you, or made you feel less than. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." And we both cried then, sitting at her small kitchen table with our empty plates and cold coffee. And I told her, "You're standing up for me now. That's what matters." And she squeezed my hand hard and said, "From now on, always, I promise you." We moved to her living room and talked for 2 more hours about things we'd never discussed before. About her own mother who'd been critical and cold. About patterns of family dysfunction that ran back generations. About how my mother had always been jealous of people she perceived as more successful or more loved, and my grandmother said, "She was jealous of you from the moment you started succeeding, from the moment it became clear you were going to surpass her in education and career, and instead of being proud, she felt threatened. And that's her failure, Maya, not yours. That's her inability to love someone without needing to control them or diminish them." My grandmother suggested I consider therapy to process my childhood and everything I was realizing now, and I told her I'd been thinking about it, that James had mentioned it too, and she nodded and said, "Good. You deserve support. You deserve help working through all of this. You don't have to carry it alone." And before I left, she walked me to the door and held both my hands and said, "I'm proud of you for walking away. It takes more courage to leave a toxic family than to stay and endure, and I know it hurts. But you did the right thing. You chose yourself and your well-being, and that's what people who love themselves do." And I drove home thinking about that phrase, people who love themselves, and realizing I was learning how to be one of them, learning that self-love wasn't selfish but necessary, wasn't indulgent but survival, and I was finally, at 32 years old, choosing to survive rather than slowly disappear under the weight of other people's expectations and demands. New Year's Eve arrived 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, and I spent the afternoon getting ready for a small gathering at James's apartment, looking at myself in the mirror and realizing I looked different somehow, lighter maybe, or just more present in my own skin. And as I applied makeup, I thought about how quiet my phone had been lately, how I'd blocked 17 numbers and restricted my social media, and now the only people who could reach me were people who genuinely cared about me. People who wanted to know how I was, rather than what I could do for them. Derek had tried one more time to reach me, sending a message through my old college friend Jennifer, asking for an $800 loan for car repairs. And Jennifer had texted me, "Derek asked me to contact you. Should I tell him you'll call him?" And I'd written back, "Please tell him no, and Jennifer, I need you to know that if he contacts you again asking you to reach me, I'll have to stop talking to you too. I can't have people serving as messengers for family members I've blocked." And she'd responded immediately, "Understood. I'm sorry he put me in that position. I won't let it happen again." And I'd appreciated her respecting that boundary, appreciated that some people understood what boundaries meant. My mother had sent a generic Happy Holidays text on Christmas Eve, probably a mass message to her whole contact list, and I'd stared at it for 30 seconds before deleting it without responding. And there had been no follow-up, no angry message about my silence, which told me she was still playing a waiting game, still expecting me to eventually break and come crawling back. Vanessa had posted something on Instagram 2 days after Christmas, a long caption about Sometimes you have to cut off toxic people, even if they're family, even if it hurts. Sometimes choosing yourself means walking away from people who don't value you. And Sophie had screenshot it and sent it to me with the message, "She's literally claiming she cut you off. She's completely rewritten what happened." And I'd laughed reading it. Actually laughed. Because 6 weeks ago, that kind of narrative distortion would have made me furious or hurt. But now I just found it pathetic, found it telling that Vanessa needed to paint herself as the victim, even in a situation where she'd been part of the cruelty. The validation I'd spent 32 years seeking from my family, that desperate need for them to see me and value me and appreciate me, I was finding it in myself now, in my own recognition of my worth, in my own understanding that I deserved better than what they'd given me. And James had said last week, "I've never seen you this happy. You're like a different person, lighter somehow." And I'd told him, I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying until I put it down. I didn't know that family could be optional, that I could just choose not to participate in my own mistreatment. Work had awarded me the leadership recognition in mid-December, a company-wide announcement, and a $15,000 bonus, and my team had taken me out to celebrate and told me I was the best director they'd ever worked with. And I'd cried in the restaurant bathroom because I'd spent so long thinking I wasn't enough, thinking I had to earn love and recognition through endless sacrifice, and here were people who valued me just for doing my job well, just for being competent and kind and present. I'd used part of the bonus to book a trip to Italy for James and me in March, 2 weeks in Tuscany, and when I'd shown him the confirmation, he'd picked me up and spun me around and said, "You're spending money on yourself, on something that brings you joy. I'm so proud of you." And I'd realized he was right, that for the first time in my adult life, I was directing my resources toward my own happiness rather than other people's endless demands. Therapy had started 2 weeks ago, sessions every Wednesday evening with Dr. Patricia Morrison, who specialized in family trauma, and in our first session, she'd listened to my story and then said, "Maya, you were the scapegoat child in a narcissistic family system. Your role was to absorb blame and provide resources while your siblings got unconditional acceptance. And nothing you did would ever have been enough because the system needed you to fail, needed you to be the problem so everyone else could avoid looking at their own dysfunction." And hearing that clinical explanation had been both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it confirmed that I'd never had a chance at normal family love. Liberating because it meant the failure wasn't mine, wasn't something I could have fixed by being better or more giving or more compliant. I was grieving now in therapy, grieving the family I'd wished I had, the mother who would have been proud of my achievements, the siblings who would have been happy for my success, the childhood where I'd felt valued and seen. And Dr. Morrison kept saying, "You're allowed to grieve what you never had. That grief is legitimate, even though the thing you're mourning never existed. You're mourning the loss of hope, the final acceptance that it will never be what you needed it to be." And I was learning to sit with that grief without letting it pull me back into dysfunction, learning that I could be sad about what I'd lost while still protecting what I'd gained. James's apartment was full when I arrived at 8, maybe 12 people. His sister Rachel and her husband Sophie, who'd become a real friend over the past 6 weeks. My grandmother, who'd insisted on coming despite the late hour. A few of my coworkers, some of James's friends from architecture school, and everyone hugged me hello and handed me champagne and told me I looked beautiful, and I felt surrounded by people who chose to be there, people who wanted to celebrate with me, people who saw me as someone worth knowing rather than someone worth using. At 11:45, we all gathered in James's living room with our champagne glasses filled, and Rachel started a countdown app on her phone, and I stood between James and my grandmother feeling something I'd never quite felt before, a sense of belonging that wasn't conditional, wasn't dependent on my usefulness or my compliance, and my grandmother squeezed my hand and whispered, "This is your year, sweetheart. This is your fresh start." And I nodded because she was right, because I was stepping into a version of my life that I'd designed rather than a role that had been assigned to me. So, at 11:58, my phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out to see my mother's name on the screen, An incoming call, and I knew exactly what this was. A New Year's reconciliation attempt on her terms, probably planning to be magnanimous and forgiving, probably expecting me to be grateful for her willingness to move past this. And I looked at that name flashing on my screen and felt nothing but tired certainty, tired of her games, certain that I was done playing. I declined the call and silenced my phone and slipped it back in my pocket. And James saw what I'd done and kissed my temple and said, "Good." And the countdown reached 30 seconds and everyone started counting together. And at midnight, we all cheered and hugged and kissed and shouted, "Happy New Year!" And I kissed James and felt my grandmother's arms around me and heard Sophie laughing nearby. And I raised my champagne glass and said loudly, "To family we choose." And everyone echoed, "To family we choose," and drank. And my grandmother looked at me with tears in her eyes and such pride on her face. And I understood in that moment that I'd finally done it. I'd finally chosen myself, chosen my own worth over their approval, chosen peace over performance, chosen freedom over the desperate hope that they might someday love me the way I'd needed them to, and I was finally, completely, irrevocably free.